Hey guys, so for this video I surveyed the players in the Branded Duelist Facebook group as well as the Discord just to gather their thoughts on the key strengths and weaknesses of Branded DESPIA. And so I actually recently provided the results for the Branded Chimera build, so definitely go check that out as well. A huge thanks to those that responded. We had a whopping 72 players respond for this one, so definitely the most participation I've had so far in these type of videos, so really appreciate it. And before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely go check out Car Brawlers or Tier 0 games depending on where you live. For pre-ordering singles for the Mega Tins, you can use code Hakuna5 for 5% off. Now, in terms of the difficulty level of this deck, the players put it at about 7.1 on average, so definitely a lot higher than in terms of, let's say, Branded Chimera. That was actually rated around 5, so definitely, while of course, as I always say, any deck requires a good pilot to do it well, but at the same time, Branded Chimera has been known to be a bit of a linear playstyle, whereas Branded DESPIA is definitely not linear at all, and I can kind of see why the difficulty level is a little bit higher in that regard. Now, in terms of where people would categorize this deck, at least among the players that actually play this deck, most do put it at Tier 2. I think that's fair. I think that's where pretty much most people would put it as well. Tier 1, I don't think so. I think if they were maybe thinking of Branded Chimera, you could argue that way. And of course, there's the argument which is better, Branded Chimera, Branded DESPIA. But at least in terms of tops, you do have a lot of Branded Chimera that has representation in that regard. But I don't think it's really at the rogue level, and who knows, maybe after a ban list, it might though. Now, in terms of the key strengths of this deck, I tried my best to summarize what the players responded, but also I actually play this deck so for once I actually have some decent insight for this video. So the first one that kind of comes up a lot is, the recursion, the board presence, as well as those layered interruptions, right? Like, for example, like the Branded in red, that will add, multiple pops, or maybe a pop but multiple draws, and possibly a search of Branded loss. And you have like Poem, for example, that can, or Rimbrum, that can bring an Albast and then feeds away your opponent's monster. So it kind of comes in steps, not necessarily all at once. So that's definitely one of the strengths. Non-targeting removal, for example, Mirror Jade is a non-targeting banish, Guardian Chimera is a non-targeting pop, and if you also play Dragoon, that is also for some reason non-targeting pop. So definitely some interesting synergies there. And so non-linear lines of play, I also sort of mentioned this as well earlier. It is definitely really fun to play. The turn 1 board can be sort of linear in that sense, but it really does depend on the hand. The Branded Fusion, the cards that you send off is definitely slightly different depending on what you already have or what you don't have. So I do enjoy that as well. I'm sure a lot of people do, but for some it might not be for them. Now, engine can break boards going second. Technically, if you were to include Super Poly as an engine, which I think you should, because in Branded, pretty much most lists are playing it, it can be really good going second. Like Fallen of Albaz itself going second can break boards, but Branded Fusion also going second can really help break boards, especially when you play something like Dragoon, and Branded Fusion can help you access that. In terms of the gimmick Puppet Lock, unfortunately, yes, that is still a key strength of the deck, being able to lock your opponents out of special summoning for the turn, really strong, and is probably something that needs to go in the next ban list. Now, in terms of the typical end board for Branded DESPIA, this is actually kind of tricky, especially as I mentioned, it is kind of layered, and not only that, some people might play slightly different ways, so I'll try to cover some of the basic examples and just provide some of the add-ons as well, just to give you some context. Now, if they're going for the gimmick lock, this is some of the most basic cards you would be seeing. In terms of the Granule, in itself is not much of an interruption. Technically, if you do special using a monster effect, then this can kind of banish itself and special something like Lulu or Quem, which can serve as interruptions. But again, if you're kind of gimmick locked, then you're not really specialing that turn anyways. So in itself, it's not really that big of a deal. Gimmick lock, that's the big deal. Really, Sanctifier gives you the opponent the gimmick lock, and then whatever, let's say they just give themselves an Allure, they can just add another Branded Fusion for follow-up as well. The Branded loss is probably there thanks to the Bestial Lubellion that got it there in the first place, and it will not only protect them in terms of like the fusion summoning window, but also probably add them the Mercury if they haven't already added already for that extra monster negate, because they are going to control something like Sanctifier. And then the Branded in red, of course, gets you for the most part something like the Guardian Chimera play. That is something that's been very standard. It's either 2 pop plus 1 draw or 1 pop plus 2 draws, which in itself can potentially add something, let's say like a hand trap. But this Branded DESPIA does not normally, it doesn't have a lot of engine space, non-engine space rather, for hand trap, so that you don't have to worry too much. Now, of course, on top of this, you could technically have Mirror Jade as well. That though does require a bit of a good hand, and in those instances when you have a gimmick Gimmick Lock plus Mirror Jade, that likely meant that they actually had to use up the Branded in Red for either the Sanctifier or the Mirror Jade, so you probably would not have Guardian Camera on top of that. Now, of course, some players don't really run the Gimmick Lock. Instead, they just kind of prioritize Branded, or rather Ad Libitum, which, to be honest with you, even people who play the Gimmick Lock may also play Ad Libitum. It is just an additional kind of brick in a way. Essentially, though, in that case, then you are going to have the Mirror Jade. They can also go into Branded Red, go into the Guardian Chimera play again, but because they banished Ad Libitum, they can actually bring back that Mirror Jade and also, again, have another banish. And not to mention, you have these other potential cards that could be on the board as well. Something like Guiding Quem, for example, which can be an interruption, right? They can trigger it, bring back that Fallen of Albaz, for example, and like fuse away like your opponent's monster. Or let's say they actually bring back something like just Mirror Jade, and so just you get another banish on top of that. Mercury, I've already talked about, it's something that you're probably adding off of the Branded Lost. In rare cases, maybe it's already in the grave and Quem actually specials it back, because Mercury can actually still serve as a monster negate while on the field as well, and not just in the hand. The Dragoon is not really an add-on. It's more of a substitute, I should say. In certain cases, like for the most part, they're not providing this, or they're not putting this on as a turn 1 board. It depends on the matchup. Against Labyrinth, maybe, if they know they're playing Labyrinth. But for the most part, this is something that they can go into more so like later in the game. But again, against certain decks, maybe even against Keshtira, especially when you get Shifter, you might just end on Dragoon instead. Now, in terms of what hand traps the Branded players respect the most, that they pilot this strategy, and again, you can kind of use this as a way to know what to side against this deck, or if you're a fellow Branded pilot, then you can kind of get a sense of what your other pilots think. And of course, not surprising, Ashe is very, very high. Ashe on Branded Fusion, it's really unfortunate when you play a deck where it has a very, very clear choke point. That's one of the things I don't like about Branded, because you always know that you're just going to Ashe the Branded Fusion and essentially nothing else. So really strong. For the most part, since the new releases, let's say Quem, Cartesia in the past like half year, it has definitely made it a little better in terms of surviving after Ashe, but there are still hands where you just immediately pass after Ashe. There's no doubt about that. I'm not going to be in denial. Bestial is also very, very good, especially the Magnanet, because it can essentially, it's such high value because it also gets you another banish essentially by adding another Bestial at the end phase. You can banish something like, let's say, the Gimmick Puppet itself, or let's say the Albion Branded Dragon, so they don't get that add or set in the end phase, or something like, let's say, whatever the Branded in Red target is. So it's very, very high value card. So Bestial, the Magnum, is definitely netting against Branded. Shifter is surprisingly actually quite good. I mean, I understand, because usually Branded players say they don't die to Shifter, and that is true, but it does really hamper the grind game, and it kind of depends. Like for the most part, let's say you're probably seeing Shifter against something like Kashtira, you're gonna be able to at least bring out Dragoon if you have access to Branded Fusion. That in itself is still kind of decent, but it's still not great. So Shifter definitely does hurt. You have a lot of cards that you kind of need the grave, right? Like the Shrouded Dragon effect to try to draw, or Nadir Servant, like those become completely dead. You also might potentially just lose that Branded Retribution, gets banished completely, so you just don't have that kind of recursion effect anymore. So it is good. Imperm / Failure. Imperm more so though, just because you can't call by Imperm. Imperm is very good on Aluber. Now there are times if they have access to Cartesia first, they can protect against something like an Imperm, but they don't have that all the time, and in those cases, Imperm on Aluber is can be very, very devastating, especially because I'm seeing a lot of Branded lists, even if they don't play Thrust, they're playing Fusion Duplication, and that only works if you actually had access to Branded Fusion. Let's say it got Ashe, but at least it's in the grave, right? But if you can't even get access to Branded Fusion, then Fusion Duplication doesn't do anything, and so Imperming on that Aluber can be quite strong, or even Quem sometimes. You can't really tell though, because they might start out with the normal summon Quem, you might Imperm that, and then they actually have Branded opening for the Aluber, so you can never really tell, but Quem is also still a good one. Bell is good, but kind of iffy, because if they have Branded Lost, then you are protected from the fusion plays. Now keep in mind, Bell does negate activations, not effects, so you can still attempt to use it when they're trying to fusion summon under Branded Lost, but you're just gonna waste that Bell, so definitely don't do that. But Bell can at least stop like the Gimmick Lock, for example. That also depends though, if you kind of do it in a way where you're using Sanctifier's effect on the fusion summoning window where they cannot respond, sure, but otherwise, like, Bell can still be very good. Crow, again, similar lines of Bestials, again, pretty good. Nibiru is interesting. It can be good. It can potentially stop the Gimmick Lock if they have, like the Sanctifier up already. Just keep in mind though, like, for example, when you Nibiru them, like, if they're probably going to have a Granule on field, so Granule, right after the Nibiru token and summons, Granule is going to banish itself from the grave and special out something like, let's say, Quem, sometimes Lulu, but probably Quem, so that still in itself is good. They probably have the Branded Dragon in the grave. They're going to have the Branded in red play, so it's not you know, you're not going to win because you Nibiru them. Like, they're going to have still some good follow-up plays. You just might stop the Gimmick Lock, but at the same time, you might actually still get Gimmick Locked if they, let's say, had something like more of a Mirror Jade on the field instead of the Sanctifier, and you Nibiru them. In that case, the Nibiru will also die because Mirror Jade's going to nuke in the end phase. And then, you know, if they have the Branded Red play, they can still go into Sanctifier on your opponent's turn and then Gimmick Lock that way. So it really depends on the board presence that the Branded player has. Veiler, we already talked about that. Droll, for the most part, is not good. There are hands where it can potentially be good. Sometimes you have no choice other than to like Gold Star, Tragedy, add Aluber because you have no access to Branded Fusion, but then you get Droll there, and it really sucks. Otherwise, you can, like, you know, if you have access, like Draw Phase, Branded Opening, so that you can add Aluber in Draw Phase, so that's kind of nice. Lancia, I think the reason why it's so low is just that no one's really playing Lancia for the last, like, at least a year, right? Otherwise, it's actually not bad. Ogre was really low. To be honest with you, I think it deserves a little bit higher. Like, don't get me wrong, if you don't have that much space aside, like, and I'm not even sure if you're really playing Ogre in the first place, but if you are, you know, it's kind of something like, sure, if you have a lot of non-engine room, you might as well put it in, because Ogre on Criticia can actually be quite good, because it essentially forces the Branded player to have to fuse if they can. So I've been in instances where my Criticia got popped. Technically, it wasn't Ogre, it was more of a Runic card, but because of that, I had to force myself to fuse away the Dragoon I had on the field, which is very good against Runic, right? So those are things that can come up and can definitely mess things up when they have something like Criticia. Next, we have board breakers. So Super Poly, of course, again, number one. This more so will probably only come up in the mirror. Not many decks are playing Super Poly anymore. Like, let's say Rescue Ace can still play it. But, you know, for the most part, I think it's kind of fading away. But it is very, very strong, especially when you get Gimmick Lock. You know, as long as you can set Super Poly, kind of play on your opponent's turn, that will still be pretty good. Evenly Match is absolutely deadly, which is why I personally play like the Gimmick Lock, because, you know, I need to give them a monster so that they can't evenly me, and if I'm gonna give them a monster, I might as well give them Gimmick Puppet. So definitely can be good. But you know what, even when they play Gimmick Puppet, sometimes their hands, they just don't go into that Sanctifier line, because the best they can do is like more like Mirror Jade, Branded Red, and Evenly Match can be very, very strong. If they play the ad-lib route, they can technically bring out something like Drago plus revive back the Mirror Jade after the Evenly Match, but honestly, that's not that very good. So just keep that in mind. Evenly Match can be very good, but against a Gimmick Lock, you're probably not going to be able to stop it, or rather not be able to use it. Dark Ruler is interesting. Obviously, most of these cards just completely taper off after the first two, but Dark Ruler, I would say, like, if the opponent's on the Gimmick Lock way, you know, for the most part, Dark Ruler is not really going to matter, right? But at the same time, if the Branded player did get interrupted, and let's say they just can only set up something like a Quem, a Criticia, and let's say like even a Branded Lost and a set, like, while that might not look that good, it's actually very misleading. It can actually completely explode with just those few cards. But in those instances where they did get interrupted like that, and they just have, like, they're relying on the Clem and the Criticia or something like that, Dark Ruler can be very, very strong. Feather Duster, Lightning Storm, more so for back row removal. Branded, it definitely does have some back row interruptions that they rely on, like Branded Red, Branded Lost, as well as, you know, something like Super Poly that they're probably playing. Definitely can be a big hindrance. Kaiju Lava Golem. Lava Golem in particular, like, you know, these are very good cards, especially if you consider the fact that which decks are playing Lava Golem, Labyrinth, and so, you know, when you're playing against Labyrinth, you're probably bringing out Dragoon, so getting Lava Golem, it does definitely hurt a lot. Droplet is very good in terms of being able to stop that Sanctifier Gimmick Puppet lock play, so better than Dark Ruler in my view. Sphere Mode, again, kind of similar lines. Rogeki Dark Hole is interesting because, you know, if they have Branded Opening in the grave, they're going to be able to protect their fusion, so it's not going to be reliable. But at the same time, if, you know, there's going to be many times where they don't have that Branded Opening protection in the grave, and it can actually be pretty good. Like, you get Gimmick Locked, you just, like, Dark Hole, Rogeki, your opponent's board away, like, they lose their Sanctifier, Granule, whatever, so at least they can't Gimmick Lock you again the next turn unless they find a way to revive them, and so you can at least have a chance to survive. But again, it's not too reliable because they might just have Branded Opening. Cosmic Cyclone is actually quite good as well, like on a Branded Loss, just so they don't get that additional ad, but also just to get rid of that protection. Books, for the most part, is not very good, just because you can still fuse with face-down monsters, at least if it's your own face-down monsters. You cannot fuse away your opponent's face-down monsters, even if you somehow knew what they were, so just keep those in mind. And Kurikara, I guess, you know, not too insane. Also, keep in mind with board breakers, when you're getting rid of Mirror Jade, at least if it was Fusion Summon, it does have that nuke effect at the end phase, so you do have to be careful with that, especially when it comes to, like, let's say you have some kind of like a tower-like monster, let's say Expelliarmus Noir, or let's say Psychic End Punisher. That Mirror Jade nuke effect in the end phase is no longer treated as an activated effect, so it will still get rid of those tower monsters. Okay, lastly, in terms of the floodgates that the branded players respect, definitely D-Barrier. This thing is just straight up shutout because we are so heavily reliant on fusion summons. At the same time, if the opponent only has D-Barrier as their only interruption, they kind of pass on that because they didn't open very well. In that case, the branded players will still have a chance. Cartesia, Branded Red, those are like quick effects, though that will still work. But if they have like kind of like their typical board plus D-Barrier, yeah, you're probably winning that game. Anti-spell is also very, very strong, especially when typically it's going to be paired with like something like Barone, for example, in Sword Soul. They're very well known for playing anti-spell on this side. Really, really strong. The thing I hate about anti-spell though is also the fact that you cannot even like activate like whatever spell that you set on your opponent's turn, something like Super Poly, Branded Opening. You have to actually still wait until your turn rolls back around to be able to use them. So really, really strong. Grave, I think technically this should be 100%. I think based on the comments I was reading in the survey, the only reason it wasn't really at 100 is because not many people are playing Grave the Super Ancient Organism anymore. But if they do, this thing is just complete FTK against Branded. Whether you go first or second, just put this in against Branded. If you get Gimmick Lock, like who cares? Just play this, set this, and then activate your opponent's turn. They will not be able to play it. The only way they can possibly even attack is just like their, Luber, Cartesia, Quem, or maybe even like Mud Dragon beatdown. But you're probably gonna win if you have Grave the Super Ancient Organism. Rivalry is also quite good. It's not as good as it used to be just because we added a little bit more spellcasters in our arsenal. But if you're playing against a deck that is playing Rivalry, or they're playing Rivalry, like you do have to be very careful if you're gonna start off with the normal summon Luber. Sometimes you don't have a choice because you have no access to Branded Fusion. But if you do already have Branded Fusion plus Luber, you do have to be careful in those strategies that play Rivalry, because for some reason Luber is a fairy. You have no fairies in your extra deck, like you are going to get screwed, so you do have to be careful there. I had an interesting interaction against a Rivalry though, against a Salad player. Basically what happened was I was stuck with Cartesia and Clem, spellcasters, right? I tried to use Cartesia effect, they try to rage pop my Cartesia, I chain Book of Moon targeting my Clem, put it face down, Cartesia dies, and now because I only have set monsters, I have no type actually, so now I can commit to a new type and actually fuse into Sanctifier with the Albaz in my hand, so now I'm actually locked into dragons. But then with Sanctifier I give them a spellcaster, so now they're actually stuck under their own Rivalry. So this is why I'm saying the book cards are very, very good in Branded, and definitely make advantage of that. Skill Drain is also very good, but it really depends on the deck you're playing against. I mean, against Labyrinth, yeah, it's going to be very rough. But the good thing with Branded is, for example, let's say Sanctifier, off one Branded Fusion, you can definitely get something like, a Sanctifier Dragon, which is a 3000 attack body, which not many people can kind of put out a 3000 body without being able to use monster effects on the field, right? So at least we have that going for us. Summon Limit is kind of good, but we are like layered interruptions. I guess we can kind of play around it. Goza Match is decent, but it's not amazing. Honestly, we have a lot of light, we have a lot of dark. We can still play under it and get beefy bodies on board. There can be only one. Honestly, sucks. Don't ever put this against Branded. Like, we're gonna be playing it if anything. So we have a lot of different types, so don't do that. Zombie World really doesn't matter. The only time it matters is that it does make it so going into Sanctifier becomes difficult, just because it does require a spellcaster. But if they have it in their hand, then it's still fine. And lastly, in terms of the weaknesses of the deck, I definitely put out a lot because I personally play this deck, as I said, so I was able to put out some more on top of what other people had already said. First one, of course, Ash on Branded Fusion. It's very, very simple. It's very clear what the choke point is. This Ash on Branded Fusion can be turn ending in many cases. It can die hard to a certain Floodgates. I talked about, in particular, D-Barrier and the Grave the Super Ancient Organism. Just straight up FTK against this strategy. Really strong, really hard time when you go against those. Brickiness. So this issue got better, a lot better, ever since the release of Quem, for example, as well as of course, Cartesia. But Branded has definitely been known to have some clunkiness issues. Again, it's gotten a lot better since even the half year ago. But there are some hands. I know you can say that about a lot of different decks, but like if you play Branded yourself, like you are gonna know that feeling. It can be definitely really clunky. In terms of, not a lot of room for non-engine, that's been very clear with Branded. The thing that really sucks about this is not just the fact that you don't have that many room for, let's say hand traps to have a chance going second, like when you lose a die roll, but it's more so that it makes it quite difficult to side when you have a lot of, engine and not a lot of non-engine space, because now you have to actually take out some key cards out of your strategy to put in some going second cards, whereas other decks, let's say something as flexible as Kashtira or Sprite, you have a lot of non-engine space that you just take out non-engine for non-engine in terms of siding. It makes it very simple. It definitely is a lot more challenging with Branded when it comes to side decking. No Omni negates, I put except for Dragoon, but the thing is, like, for the most part, Branded players are not putting up Dragoon turn 1 like blindly, right? So in that sense, the no Omni negates definitely can hurt. Again, with something like Evenly Match, our only way to stop that is Sanctified Dragon, and so if you don't go into that route, like not having an Omni negate and getting hit by Evenly really hurts. The lack of non-fusion plays, again, once you use something like branded fusion or even something like branded opening actually, as well as fusion deployment, they all have that restriction where you can only go into fusion monsters. So that really does suck. It definitely makes it so that our extra deck is not as like toolboxy as some other decks are. I'm not sure why tier limits back when they were tier 1, tier 0, how they were able to not have that kind of restriction at all, but branded did. It definitely can be very challenging. And lastly, lack of in-engine back row removal. The only way we can really, pop back row with our own engine is like that branded in red with Guardian Chimera, popping up to max 2 back row. But at the same time, that does also rely on a monster effect to pop back row, which is not really ideal because those are a lot easier to negate. It would be nicer if you had kind of like back row removal through your own back row. Of course, branded beast is one option, but for the most part, branded DESPIA players are not playing that anymore. And so the other possible option is side decking Shaddoll Dragon, because when you send that off of branded fusion, you can at least pop something like, let's say, Grave the Super Ancient Organism or Skill Drain. But again, I'm not actually seeing that much anymore. So anyways, that was it for the branded DESPIA breakdown based on the player survey responses. I had a lot of fun making this one because, again, this is a deck that I personally play, so I actually had some better commentary for this one, unlike some of the other videos. But you can certainly go check out some of the other ones I did. Branded Chimera, Manadium, Pearly, Infernoble. I did it on a lot of different decks. I'm going to continue to do this kind of video with a lot of different meta decks moving forward, so I'm really excited. It definitely helps me learn as well. Hopefully it helped you too. So big thanks to all of you for watching. Huge thanks to my patrons as always for supporting the channel. A big thanks to my newest Patreon, Sonic Sounds, as well. And well, take care, guys.